Every few years, Singapore debates something absurd to foreign ears. Has Singapore saved too much?
Are we saving too much? How much is enough? There is no such number.
When claims are made that there's no such thing as oversaving, it smacks of rigid ideology, not reasoned debate.
And it gets even stranger. You might expect Singapore's opposition to attack how the country manages its reserves. But even adversarial politics around the reserves is deliberately constrained.
Directly questioning individual investment decisions for the sole purpose or a political purpose of pressuring the investment teams is not in the House's interest.
And we're not talking about small sums. Singapore's reserves are well over $1 trillion, at least 7 times the government's annual spending. Today, investment returns contribute roughly $1 in 5 collected by the government. Not oil, not diamonds, investments. Without them, Singapore's low tax model starts to break. Singapore will need to raise taxes dramatically. For example, by doubling either personal income taxes or GST. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Is Singapore better viewed as a country or a fund that runs a country? If Singapore is really a fund that runs a country, then who first collected the money? Meet our first character, CPF, the collector. And strangely enough, this story does not begin with Lee Kuan Yew. It doesn't even begin with the PAP. It begins with one of Lee's rivals, Lim Yew Hock. 80 years ago, retirement for many workers was less golden years and more good luck. Some employers might give a gratuity, $1,000, maybe 2. Most gave nothing. One newspaper described retirement outside government service as a nightmare. Work ended, income ended, and many workers ended their lives in poverty. So in 1949, Lim pushed for something radical. Legislation for social security, medical care, sickness benefits, unemployment support, and old age pensions. 2 years later, another politician entered the stage, Tan Chai Cheng. He proposed a provident fund. Now a provident fund sounds incredibly exciting, which is why almost nobody outside of finance knows about it. A pension works like this.
Current workers pay, current retirees receive.
A provident fund works differently.
You save, your account grows, you retire.
Think of it as forced saving with future you as the beneficiary. The colonial government initially preferred a pension model, but after marathon debates, the Provident Fund won. 16 months later, the scheme was finalized. Workers contributed 5%, employers another 5%. And immediately, people got angry. Some workers could barely afford food. One Straits Times letter writer complained, "We are already living hand to mouth. We should be exempted." During one of Singapore's most turbulent periods, the unrest surrounding the Hock Lee bus riots, protesters demanded the repeal of the CPF bill. So just 2 days before CPF was supposed to start, Lim hit the brakes. The scheme was delayed. Eventually, low-wage workers were exempted from contributing, although employers still had to pay. CPF survived, with an arm chopped off. And at this point, CPF had nothing to do with sovereign wealth funds, nothing to do with global investing. It was simply the collector. Then came 1959. Lee Kuan Yew swept to power. He did not dismantle CPF. He expanded it. Contribution rates gradually rose. But the bigger change came later. CPF took on a second role, a system for converting wages into national capital. Currently, 1/3 of wages, split between employers and employees, gets channeled to CPF. The government promises between 2.5% and 6% of interest, depending on factors such as the account type. When CPF money is collected, it doesn't sit idle. It is exchanged for Special Singapore Government Securities, or SSGS for short. Basically, IOUs issued by the government to CPF accounts. In other words, the government creates an asset and a liability at the same time. CPF members receive guaranteed interest. The government receives the freedom to invest the funds. The money enters the national balance sheet, and from there, it's invested by Singapore's Sovereign Wealth Fund, GIC, or Government of Singapore Investment Corporation. GIC doesn't buy Singapore assets, it buys the world. Stocks, bonds, real estate. This is the real transformation. Singapore takes domestic savings and converts them into ownership of the world economy. How much ownership? CPF has over $600 billion in funds, though the exact amount GIC has is not disclosed. This opacity is politically controversial.
Our nation's eye-watering reserve stock was built on the backs of sacrifices made by our past and present generations for the sake of future needs. Our nation's reserves belong, therefore, to the people, not to the government. Few people I know would be happy if their banks did not permit them to know or check the value of their current balances.
We look at our reserves as part of our national security, not unlike our critical military capabilities. And we don't go around telling the world what our military capabilities are.
But we know GIC has returned about 5 to 6% per year in US dollar terms over the long run. If you simplify the system and assume CPF savings are ultimately invested at a similar long run rate, while members receive 3.5% interest, the theoretical spread is around 2%. On a base of roughly $650 billion, that's on the order of $10 to $15 billion a year. That's nearly enough to fund Singapore's entire education system, which ranks among the best in the world. Notice this mechanism inverts the welfare state idea. In most welfare states, the government taxes and redistributes the proceeds heavily. But in Singapore, the citizens save, the state invests collectively, and the returns help fund the state itself. To be clear, Singapore's objective isn't to maximize profit, or anything like that. 80% of Singaporeans live in public housing, and most of them benefit from significant government subsidies. Something difficult to explain if the country was only trying to maximize its budget surplus. The biggest objective is somewhat different.
At the end of the day, whom do we owe our deepest obligation to as a government? To the future. Not just to the present, certainly not to the past.
So my team and I make this pledge to our youth and to the generations that follow. We will build Singapore with you in mind.
In this worldview, compounding capital is not merely economics. It's how a small state extends its lifespan. The opposition says Singaporeans should benefit more from GIC's returns.
What is preventing the government from allowing regular citizens like you and me from benefiting from the government's fund manager GIC? Can we not allow GIC's returns to be passed through to CPF members? Allowing CPF members to benefit from GIC's portfolio even to a modest degree can make a huge difference in enabling more CPF members to better save for their retirement.
But it agrees that most excess returns should be saved for future Singaporeans. Singapore is organized around preserving and compounding national capital across generations, similar to how Harvard University's endowment fund enables it to spend today and tomorrow. And Singapore goes beyond Harvard's endowment fund. It owns some of the country's most recognizable businesses: Singapore Airlines, Singtel, and CapitaLand, which means part of Singapore's national wealth sits not only in markets, but in operating businesses. And that creates a problem. If the government owns an airline, is it running a business or is it running policy? If it owns telecom infrastructure, should it behave like a company or an arm of government? Singapore wanted the answer to be crystal clear. So in 1974, the government created Temasek Holdings, and its design was quietly radical. Temasek is not a ministry, even though it's owned by the Minister of Finance. It's not a regulator. It's not a central bank. It's a holding company that behaves like a global investor. If CPF is the collector, gathering national savings, and GIC is the investor, sending capital into global markets, then Temasek is something different. Temasek is the owner. To be precise, the owner of ownership. The government transfers its stakes into Temasek. Temasek becomes the shareholder. Not a ministry, not a department, a corporate entity governed under company law. So instead of this, you get this. And that single step changes everything. These firms can now be run commercially. Professional boards, earnings reports, market discipline. Even if the shareholder remains the state, today, Temasek's portfolio isn't just a shadow map of Singapore. There's investments across Asia, Europe, and the United States. Temasek now behaves less like a national holding company and more like a globally diversified equity fund anchored to a state. It has $226 billion in Singapore and $208 billion overseas for a total portfolio of $434 billion. You could give every Singaporean the median worker's annual salary and still have money left over. Temasek doesn't promise fixed returns. It doesn't guarantee payouts to citizens. Instead, its performance is measured like a market investor. Over long periods, its returns have broadly tracked global equity markets, sometimes outperforming, sometimes underperforming, but always reinvesting gains back into the portfolio. And crucially, those gains don't flow directly into government spending every year. The link is less direct. More on that later. And there's one more crucial piece of the puzzle that makes Singapore more like a fund than a country. In the early 1980s, the government made some politically unpopular moves and faced an unprecedented groundswell of discontent, one which forced them to abandon some changes. Lee Kuan Yew feared for Singapore's future.
If there is a freak election result and a coalition forms the government, all the reserves are available. The larder is wide open. You can raid it. 25 years' work, savings. You can go on a spending spree for 5 years, and then we are another broken back country. So we've thought out some blocking mechanisms so that no government can spend previously built up reserves. And I think we should have a president with a moral authority to block it. The thing has to be thought out very carefully because there's bound to be a row when the president says no to a newly elected prime minister. Flush with victory, he wants to fulfill his election promises. How do we do this? I think the president has to be elected by the people, direct vote, not in parliament. So he also has moral authority.
Not everyone agreed with the proposal.
The president can, under the proposal, thwart a government elected by the people from carrying out the mandate of the people.
And that exactly was the issue. Should a government control national funds? Eventually, Singapore proceeded with Lee's answer. No. Lee's idea became constitutional design. Singapore's head of state now had powers that went beyond ribbon cutting and ceremonial speeches. Those powers are often called the second key. Imagine a vault. Inside are reserves accumulated by previous generations. The government holds one key. The president holds another. And if the government wants to spend reserves it did not build itself, the president can say, no. This is not about annual budgets. It's not about schools. It's specifically about past reserves. wealth accumulated before the current government took office. And wealth here does not just mean past budget surpluses. It includes Singapore's foreign reserves managed through MAS and strategic state assets tied to institutions like HDB and JTC. HDB houses around 80% of Singapore's population. JTC manages 80% of Singapore's industrial land. And land produced one of Singapore's strangest fiscal debates. In many countries, when the government sells or leases land, they can spend the money. Singapore treats it differently. When the government leases land, often for 99 years, the proceeds don't enter the budget as ordinary income. Their logic is this: when land becomes cash, it's the same wealth, just in a different form.
There is no net increase in the reserves when state land is first sold and the sale proceeds are transferred to the financial assets. It's just a conversion of one asset form to another. There is no net increase in the reserves when the land returns to the state after the lease expires.
The opposition has a different view.
If a single piece of land is sold repeatedly for as long as the lease lasts, how does that cohere with the Prime Minister's position that land is just a conversion?
They don't agree what should be put into the vault. But both sides agree the vault should remain, even if they don't agree who should hold the second key. And the vault has so much. But here's the twist. The second key wasn't designed so the vault would never open. It was designed so that opening it would be extraordinary. And twice in modern history, Singapore turned the key. First, 2008.
The worst financial crisis since the Great Depression.
Singapore drew on past reserves to support jobs and businesses.
For the first time ever, Singapore dips into its reserves to fund a budget to save jobs and boost lending.
Then came something even bigger. 2020. Airplanes disappeared from the skies. Borders closed. Economies froze. This time the draw was enormous. $40 billion from past reserves. Suddenly the reservoir that had been filling for decades started flowing back. And notice what happened. Singapore did not build the reserves because of COVID. COVID merely showed how reserves work as a national shock absorber. Singapore's reserves are not merely money. They are an institution, protected by the Constitution. A promise, a claim by future Singaporeans. And now, Singapore simply cannot spend everything the reserves earn. If the investment system earns $100 after inflation, Singapore does not take $100. Only $50 of long-term expected returns can support current spending. The remainder stays invested and strengthens the reserves. The reservoir supplies water, but it keeps filling. Even the opposition rarely argues. Drain the reservoir. Instead, the argument is usually how much of the harvest belongs to today.
When we talk about the reserves, we're not talking about raiding them. It's about slowing the growth slope of the reserves.
This sounds less like a fight over budgets and more like a discussion inside an endowment committee. Putting everything together, the opening question returns. Is Singapore more of a country or a fund that runs a country? Maybe the answer is Singapore is a country, but it's better viewed as an intergenerational endowment fund, a fund that enables an exceptional country. Because Singapore is built around one question: how will we survive for generations? Because people and societies are defined by the questions they refuse to stop asking. Thanks for watching.